if you sort of follow the popular media to some extent. So my talk is, all the titles have changed because we have to give the titles ages in advance, and then of course things evolve. So my title is Plastic Pollution, Myths, Monitoring and a Mystery, and if you'll pardon all the alliteration. So I'll start off by just exploring some of the things that you might have read and kind of look at what basis there is for those kind of alarming statistics perhaps. Monitoring, I think, is really important because it's the fundamental basis of how we know whether we're doing things right or not. So it's part of the whole management cycle. We'll talk about that. And then I'll end off, hopefully, with a little bit of a mystery to keep you in suspense, if nothing else. If you don't recognize this is a flip-flop drifting along. It's got a pelagic crab and a few goose barnacles on. And when you travel at sea, particularly in the warmer climates, it's an incredible number of flip-flops that you see washing up. You'll have to bear with me a little bit. I've just come back from 3 months on Inaccessible Island, so I'm full of inaccessible stories, so I'm going to keep saying, on Inaccessible Island. And there's a lot of plastic that gets washed up there. For those of you who don't know where Inaccessible is, it's in the middle of the South Atlantic. It's one of the Twisted da Cunha Islands. It's an uninhabited island, and so it makes quite a nice site for sort of long-term monitoring because there's no interference from people, or very little interference from people in terms of beachcombing activity. Okay, so let's get to the myths. So this is from the Plastic Pollution Coalition website. They've got a thing called The Facts, and the first fact is plastic never goes away. And then you read a bit further and they say plastic items can take up to 1,000 years to decompose. And you kind of go, well, if it never goes away, where's it going if it's decomposing? Plastic bottles last up to 450 years. Where do these numbers come from? We haven't had plastics for that long. As Von said yesterday, the first plastics were only developed in the late 19th century and really only went into production after the Second World War in any significant amounts. So this is from our beachcombing on Inaccessible. This is the oldest item we found. One of the fun things about manufactured plastic items is they often have date stamps on. This is a sort of typical date stamp. It has the year, is the 71, and the little arrow points to the month. So this was a big black plastic container that was manufactured in March 1971, 47 years old. So it's still going strong. One of the reasons why it's still going strong, it's black. Black is a good color. If you compare that to this Coke bottle, only 7 years old, it's already looking pretty buggered up. The lid is made of high-density polyethylene, and that's degraded quite badly already. It's falling apart. In fact, when we took the lid off this bottle, it just crumbled into pieces. The rest of the bottle is made of PET, slightly more resilient. So what's breaking down these plastics? There's two major things. One is ultraviolet light, and the other is mechanical abrasion. And one of the sort of issues is that they don't really break down plastics into component atoms. They break them down into smaller bits of plastic. So they're basically making microplastics along the way. And if you're interested in the process behind this, I've written it up there. But basically, UV makes plastic go brittle and friable, and the time it takes to do that depends on the thickness of the plastic. The additives that are in there, things like stabilizers, can be put in to slow down this process. But basically, the UV is a high-energy radiation that comes in, disrupts the carbon bonds, and makes the plastic much less resilient than it was before. Oops, what are we doing? So here's a container from the beach on Inaccessible, and if we zoom in, you can see that it's busy breaking down into little tiny fragments of plastic. And this container was 28 years old. It was made in 1990. It was a Canadian oil container. The other major impact in terms of breaking down big plastic items is mechanical activity. And this is particularly obvious in high-energy environments like shorelines, particularly things like cobble beaches where you've got stones rolling around. And I attended a talk last year which was really fun by a Russian scientist who's been doing some really innovative work. And she simulated a cobble beach environment using a concrete mixer. And I can just imagine the sort of registrar of the university kind of looking slightly askance when a concrete mixer appeared on the research budget. But she put plastic items into a concrete mixer with some pebbles and some water and just left it to run and assessed how quickly the things started to break down. And this gives you some idea. This is a sequence of bottles of different ages from Inaccessible, which is all cobble beaches. And so you've got a fresh bottle on the left, and by the time they've been on the island for 3 or 4 years, they're already looking pretty buggered. Look at the lids though, the lids haven't degraded. They're not being, this damage is not due to UV, it's due to the mechanical abrasion that they're getting from being bounced around by the rocks, driven by wave action. Interestingly, one of the sort of characteristics of plastics is they don't break down bacterially, so they're not subject to biological degradation. At least that was the case until 2016. The paper came out in Science from a bunch of Japanese researchers who found a bacterium living in a recycling depot in Japan that could break down PET. It was a PET recycling depot, ironically. And there have been a couple of papers since then. This one came out last year showing that there's bacteria in the guts of earthworms that can break down polyethylene. And you might think, wow, this is wonderful. The only trouble is we rely on plastics so much in so many facets of our life that if they were readily broken down by bacteria, it would really have major disruptions to the way we do things. You can just imagine all of our communication, transport, construction. We use plastics all over the place in long life applications, and we rely on the fact that they don't get broken down biologically. So that's something to be concerned about. Okay. So maybe plastics don't live as long as we think, but we don't really know. I mean, these numbers of 1,000 years, 450 years, they're just complete thumbsucks. Nobody has any real idea. A lot depends on where the item ends up, whether it's in the sun or not, whether it's in a high-energy environment or not. So things that end up on the seabed, where there's very little wave action, sort of in the deep sea, and there's no UV exposure, probably do live for a very long time before they start to degrade. But if they're on a high-energy beach or in an area with high UV, they break down quite quickly. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about just a little bit is the sort of statistics and what they mean. Whenever you see a statistic around plastics, you need to interrogate a little bit. Here's a typical one: 90% of litter on beaches is plastic. Here's another one that's had a lot of traction over the last 2 decades. In the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, there's 6 times more plastic than zooplankton. Okay, whenever you see these kinds of relative values, like percentages or comparisons between things, you have to ask yourself, what's being measured? What's the currency? In the first case, it's typically numbers of items. When people talk about percentages of plastic, they pretty much always fall back to numbers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Interestingly, in the case of the other one, they're actually talking about the mass of plastic. And Charles Moore's paper is very clear that zooplankton was 5 times more abundant than plastic. It was just 6 times less massive. So there were a few large bits of plastic which weighed more than the zooplankton. So it's very much a case of selective reporting in these kinds of things. Oh, that's interesting, the picture has changed. But it's a weird thing that Mac does sometimes. So fortunately the picture has changed to one that also works. This is the net that they use to get those statistics. It's a very shallow net that just skims the surface top 10 centimeters or so. So you're hardly sampling the zooplankton of the upper surface of the water. You're just catching the floating stuff. And it's not surprising that you had a lot more plastic than zooplankton in this case. So there's 2 biases creeping into these things. But people love reporting these statistics because they attract the public attention. Really, we should be reporting both mass and number because they tell you different things. The reason why people like to talk about number of plastic items is because plastics are light, and if you start talking about the contribution by mass, it doesn't look as impressive. When you're far away from land, then you see there's not really much difference. So this again is inaccessible, lots of plastic junk on the beach, and the proportion of plastic in terms of number and mass is more or less the same. As we come closer to home, we start to see more mass contribution by other things. Sandy beaches, not so obvious because everything's floated there, but the work that we've done with the beach co-op at Muizenberg, looking at the rocky intertidal, only 1/3 of the rubbish that accumulates in the rocky intertidal is actually plastic by mass, but it's still dominant in terms of numbers. Okay. I can carry on, thank you. And then if you come closer to home still, where all the rubbish comes from, this is just a little survey we did last year looking at street litter. Only 41% of the items are plastic and makes up only 20% by mass. And that compares to about 9% plastic mass in domestic refuse. Just as a complete aside, the daily accumulation data, I did some walks every morning in Newlands from sort of the Westerford area up to UCT. We were getting 133 bits of rubbish every day and 1.2 kilograms of rubbish per kilometre of roadside.
Can I just mic you up?
No, I don't want to be mic'd up.
Oh, that's
Do
good.
I need a mic?
No, it's...
We're fine.
No, it's also good because our lectures are getting recorded, so it's good for recording as well if you have the mic on, because they're going to be uploaded online. So
you're going to be appearing on my lecture?
I'm a celebrity, so it's...
You're a celebrity. Where do you want me to put it? Watch the nipples. Okay, so in Newlands, it's quite a disturbing amount of junk that one collects every day. And Eleanor did some stuff in Sea Point. She was getting 250 cigarette butts per kilometre per day, which, if you multiply up by lengths of roads around Cape Town, it is pretty disgusting. Anyway, the point that I want to make is that whether you look at the percentage by number or the percentage by mass, you see a steady increase in the relative proportion of plastic in the contribution to the litter stream as you move from close to source areas in urban areas, the street litter, through South African beaches out into the open ocean. Why is this? Obviously, it's due to the fact that plastic disperses well and it lives a long time. So there are other things that might disperse quite well, but they just don't live long enough to go really big distances. Plastic has this dual sort of feature of being able to disperse and last a long time in the environment. So this is Kelvin Air Dump. It's actually not the dump, it's next to the dump. So this is all stuff that's blown out of the dump, and you can see a bag flying away there. So it gets transported by air, it gets transported by water. This is in a very upmarket suburb in sort of Midrand area, but it's downstream from a township area. And as a result, plastic goes everywhere. Somebody came up to me yesterday and was saying it's really horrifying to think that there are parts of the planet that we've never been to that plastic has got to. And here's some plastic from the Arctic Ocean seabed. We've hardly been to the Arctic Ocean seabed. Only tiny areas have been visited, and yet there's plastic all over that seabed. Here's another sort of typical statistic that you might see. This came out fairly recently in Science. The most polluted spots host more than 10 billion pieces of litter per square kilometre. Sounds absolutely horrendous, and it is absolutely horrendous. But when you see numbers like this, you have to sort of think, well, okay, what does that mean? Obviously, it's a number thing, it's not a mass thing, so what size things are we talking about? And it's really critical that you think about what sizes of things are being measured. And you can't start to compare densities of plastic in different environments unless you're using the same gateway thresholds as to what you consider a piece of plastic. So do you go down to, like a beach cleanup, you might pick up things down to a centimetre or so. But if you go with your sieve, you might go down to a millimetre or so. But if you go with your fancy extraction, you might get down to, I don't know, a hundredth of a millimetre. And if you get really, really fancy, maybe you can get even smaller than that. And that lower size threshold is particularly critical because typically as you get smaller, so you get more and more bits of plastic. Because of that fact, as plastic starts to break down, it breaks down into little bits. And there's obviously lots of little bits come from one large bit. So a few years ago, we asked the question, well, how much litter is there on a beach? And I guess many of you have probably gone and done a beach cleanup on Coastal Cleanup Day or volunteered with various other groups. And you know that you can walk a stretch of coast and you can pick up all the big litter, and then you can walk back again and you'll find some more, because you just keep finding stuff. And as you get more sensitized, you start picking up smaller and smaller bits. And it's a bit like a fractal problem. It's like asking, how long is a coastline? Well, it depends how you measure the coast. Do you go around every boulder, or do you just go around every bay? And this is the same sort of problem that we face when measuring the amount of plastic.
So here's our hypothetical beach. We've got the sea washing in, and it's got a low tide line, a bunch of high tide lines, depending on whether it's spring or neaps, and then you've got a storm strand line and some back dune field. And we did this work up at 16 Mile Beach in the West Coast National Park, north of Azefontein. And we marked out 50-meter transects and picked up all the big stuff, bigger than about 2 centimeters. And then we were cognizant of the fact that there's stuff buried in the beach, so we dug down 15 centimeters and sieved through a 1 centimeter sieve to try to find out how much is buried there. And then we did a smaller transect sieving with a 2 millimeter sieve to get the sort of industrial pellet nurdle type stuff. And then we also did some sediment cores, which Eleanor slaved through the beginning of last year, where we just take a core of sand and then separate it using flotation to get all the very fine things, mostly fibers. And we obviously do that lots of times to get some idea of how variable our results are. What do we find? Well, the first thing you find is it's quite hard work, so it's good to have students to help you do this. But this is what you find if you just look at big litter. So the things that you would pick up in a beach cleanup exercise, things that are bigger than about 2 centimeters or so. What do we find? Only 14% of litter items are actually on the surface of the beach. So when you do a beach cleanup, you're only picking up about 1 in 7 items. However, those 1 in 7 items are the majority of the plastic because they're all the big things. It's much more difficult to bury a big thing than it is to bury a small thing. So most of the buried litter is relatively small. Sorry, I should probably explain these axes. Just bear in mind, this is a log scale. So this is something that weighs 10 kilograms, 1 kilogram, 100 grams, etc. And by the time you get down here, you're dealing with relatively small bits of plastic. If we then integrate all of the other sampling, the sieving with the 2 mil sieves and the horrible sand cores that Eleanor sampled, we find that there's loads and loads of little things. We get a peak where there's industrial pellets, those nurdles, because historically we've spilled lots of those and they're still around in the environment. But the huge numbers, tens of thousands of fibers. So this is all expressed per meter of beach. So an average bit of West Coast beach has 36,000 bits of plastic, okay? But that figure is only meaningful if you explain that you're going down to the size of fibers. If you were interested in big bits of plastic, the number would be in the low hundreds, not the thousands. And again, one has to, this is just a sort of a typical extraction showing all of the fibrous material. Again, we haven't actually typed this, so we don't know how much of this is truly synthetic fiber and how much is natural fibers from cotton or wool or other cellulose-based things. But if you're interested in the mass, and I guess we really should be interested in the mass because that's where the bulk of the material is, it's all sitting in the big stuff. The fact that there's hundreds of thousands of fibers is pretty meaningless because they are so small. They might have some biological impacts, but in terms of the mass balance of plastic, they're completely trivial. Again, this is a log scale, so we're talking orders of magnitude difference. All of the stuff is sitting in the big things. And that's why it's worth going out and cleaning beaches, because you get the stuff while it's still big, you can do something with it, you can get it out the system before it breaks down into small things. So if we just do the contrast, in terms of numbers of items, virtually everything is a fiber. If we exclude the fibers, still only about a quarter of things would we consider large plastic items. But if we look at mass, 93% of the mass is sitting in large plastics, and we're not talking very large here. Okay, so small items dominate by number, large items contribute most of the mass. And this is not atypical. This was a paper that came out last year from, the map's gone all weird. Sorry, the Mac thing. So there was supposed to be a map of this is the bottom of the map of the Pacific garbage patch showing the distribution. Laurent Lebreton, this is out of Boyan Slat's ocean cleanup group, did a major survey of the Pacific garbage patch to estimate how much rubbish there was in there, and they came up with, they used airplanes, they used multiple vessels, they had giant nets as well as normal nets for net sampling, and they came up with an estimate of 1.9 trillion bits of plastic. Don't specify how small they go, and well, they went down to 300 micron mesh nets. 79,000 tons. But if you look at where the mass was, microplastics, in other words, things less than 5 millimeters by their definition, made up 94% of the number of items, but only 8% of the mass. So the vast majority, again, is sitting in a few big items. If we jump back to inaccessible, it's a rocky beach, relatively few bits of plastic on the beach because we can't sample rocky beaches easily. All the small things disappear in amongst the boulders. So relatively low density of items, 7.4 items per meter. But it's 4 times the amount of rubbish on a mass basis than there was at Azefontein. And a lot of that is driven by a few big items. 56 individual items accounted for half of the total mass. This was one of our pet hates. It was this massive sort of pipe with a steel core and a rubbery plastic outside. We couldn't move this thing. It weighed a couple of 100 kilos. Eventually, we rolled it down into the sea just because we were tired of seeing it every day when we walked down the beach. But it was, it was kind of on our survey route, but it was about 500 meters from our hut. And what did it do? It washed up right in front of our hut, which was really annoying. Caused a bit of consternation with the local penguins who all came over to have a look at it. Okay, and then the final sort of myth-type statistic, which has really been picked up by the media. This was a paper that came out in 2015. Chris Wilcox, CSIRO, he's a modeler, doesn't know anything about birds, wrote this paper about how 99% of seabirds will contain ingested plastic by 2050. And if you read the paper, he doesn't say 99% of birds, but that's what's been picked up. That's lifted from a UNEP report last year. It's 99% of species. But even that's dubious, because how can you extrapolate across species? You're assuming that species are kind of like, all the same, and we can just treat them as statistical units. So it's a completely rubbish paper. If it asked me to review it, I would have rejected it. But it got published in a very high-flying journal. Anyway, but we're not really interested in what proportion of species, I guess we are interested in what proportion of species contain plastic. I suspect that every single bird in the world at a species level, certainly seabird, will eat plastic at some stage, just because virtually every fish has a fiber in it or something. But if we look at substantial bits of plastic that you can actually see, the proportions of birds that contain plastic vary across taxa, and this is linked to what Monica was talking about yesterday. Why do animals eat plastic? In the case of birds, a lot of them are eating plastic because of sort of misdirected foraging, particularly the generalist omnivores, these oceanic seabirds like storm petrels, and phalaropes. They just basically eat anything that floats. They'll eat pumice, they'll eat seeds, they'll eat any rubbish that's lying around on the sea surface. So these are the birds that are of most concern, because these are the ones that have the highest proportion of individuals, which is what we're interested in. So that 99% doesn't speak anything to this proportion of individuals. It's just saying how many seabirds at species level might contain plastic in 30 years. So it's a really dubious figure. But it leads me to what I think is a really important thing to consider, and that is the proportion of individuals that contain plastic is a function of two things. It's a function of how often they ingest plastic, but also how regularly they get rid of that plastic. How long do they keep it in their system? So you could eat plastic all day long, but if you spit it out straight away, you're not going to find much plastic in someone. But if you keep that plastic in you for months and months, you don't have to eat very much very often to slowly over time start to accumulate large loads. And so different types of organisms have different retention patterns. So things like gulls, they're used to eating lots of rubbish with hard bits in, and they just puke it back up again. They produce these regurgitated pellets. And so gulls probably do eat quite a lot of plastic. If you go down to the dump, you'll see them eating plastic all the time, but they just puke it back up, and they're not particularly high on the scale. 15% of individuals contain plastic on average, but that's not as high as some of these other birds that are living much further away from human modified environments, whereas the gulls are feeding on dump sites. So the problem comes with these retainers, the birds that don't seem to regurgitate, but they also don't excrete large bits of plastic. Yesterday, Von talked about fur seals. Fur seals mainly are getting very small bits of plastic through their prey, and then they can just excrete it straight away. And I suspect that humans pretty much fit within this category. So if you're worried about getting plastic in your seafood, I suspect that it probably goes through you quite quickly. I don't think there's any evidence that we retain it for long periods. And the retention is particularly important for the chemical impact associated with plastics. This is a nice paper from Shigi Takada's group in Japan, which showed that the amount of toxic compound leaching out of plastic was a function of two things. It was a function of the stomach environment. So if there was stomach oil, or even better, fish oil in the stomach, then more leached out more quickly. But if you just had an aqueous solution, then much less leached out. But also the time that it's in there. So again, if you ingest some plastic, but you shit it out or you throw it up within a few hours, it's probably not going to do you any harm. So it's really important that we understand what the residence time is for ingested plastic if you're interested in this toxic transfer process. And there's been a lot of attention in the media about shellfish in particular, because shellfish obviously are filter feeders. There's lots of little bits of plastic in the sea. People worry about them taking up that plastic. If you chat to mussel biologists, they're adamant that this is not a problem. So mussels have a particularly intertidal type and shallow subtidal type mussel species, which are the ones that we mostly exploit, have evolved to live in turbid environments that have lots of sand and other stuff mixed up in the water that they're feeding on, and they've got mechanisms to cope with it. Basically, something that's not edible gets shunted sideways, accumulated in mucus, and excreted as what's called pseudo-feces. So it never even goes into the animal. The small bits of plastic that do go in tend not to remain very long. That's sort of the microplastic story. There was a paper that came out last year which was picked up in Science looking at scallops and nanoplastics. Remember yesterday we were talking about nano being very, very small, less than 0.001 of a millimeter, and we can't actually measure them in the wild because we can't discriminate them from other organics. But if they're labeled with radio markers, this experiment, they actually labeled them and fed them specifically to scallops, and they found that some of the very small ones were taken up through the gut wall, so they went into the muscle, so that is potentially a concern. But if you put them into a clean environment, all trace of them was gone within 2 weeks. Larger particles remained within the digestive tract, couldn't migrate across that mucous membrane to get into the cells, but were retained for up to 7 weeks. But again, before you stop eating scallops, I would ask you, does it really matter if you eat very occasionally very small bits of plastic, because they're probably just going to go straight through you in a matter of hours. And as far as I know, there's been no residency time studies on nano or even microplastics in humans. I know Vonica found a paper about microplastics in human stool. We're not going to repeat that survey. Okay, the other sort of aspect around ingestion is how much is a problem. So there's a bunch of problems that Vonica talked about yesterday, but probably most of them are only really a problem when you eat a lot of plastic. So this was our poster child for what not to be if you're a great shearwater. This individual bird we found dead on Inaccessible. It had 204 bits of plastic in its stomach. All of that plastic came out of that bird. It's really the worst polluted bird I've ever seen. Whether that plastic load contributed to its death, we don't know. We just found it dead after a very cold night. However, the distribution of big plastic loads in these kinds of birds is very much skewed. So white-chinned petrels, about 40% of them contain plastic. There's a few that have potentially got a problem, but most of the population has not got very much plastic in at all. So again, one needs to look at is this really a significant issue? Less than 1% of them contain more than 20 plastic items. In Europe, they're using birds as indicators of environmental quality, so they have this ecological quality objective that says less than 10% of fulmars found dead on beaches in the North Sea should contain more than 0.1 of a gram of ingested plastic, and that figure there shows how that pattern has changed over time. You'll see that encouragingly it's not going up, it's coming down. It's very much smooth, those data. The data are quite noisy. But still, the trend was from the 1990s to the 2000s, the amount of plastic in fulmars decreased over time in the North Sea, which is kind of encouraging. The proportion is still well above the threshold that they want. They want to have that red line, so they want those dots to come all the way down to the red line. But you could argue, is that red line really critical? It represents less than 0.013% of the body mass. So it's a very, very small amount of plastic that they're worrying about in these birds. Okay, so that's kind of the myth section. Let's talk a little bit about monitoring. So when I started working on plastics in seabirds back in the 1980s, there was no information about plastics in the environment in Southern Africa. So my girlfriend and I at the time decided, well, we better go and get some beach data. Sounded like a good excuse for a holiday. So we went along the South African coast from Cape Town to the Kai mouth, and we sampled a bunch of beaches. And because we were interested in the kind of plastic that birds eat, we did this sieving process. And every 5 years, we've gone back to the same beaches, and we've sieved those beaches, and we also sample them for macro litter at the same time. And this is sorry, I've forgotten about this slide. This is why we're interested in monitoring. Monitoring is a key part of the whole sort of management cycle. So if we think there's a problem, we can plan solutions, we can implement the mitigation, but we don't know whether we're successful unless we can actually measure some change in the environment. And based on what we find with our monitoring, we can reassess the problem, and round we go, and hopefully eventually address the problem. And one of the sort of basic questions we might want to ask is, so what's happening with plastic abundance? And that's a horrific picture. It really is horrible. It's Lisa Guastella's picture from KZN coast, just south of Durban, after a big rain event. Quite unbelievable the amount of junk that comes out of those catchments. But if you go to that beach, most of the time it doesn't look anything like that. It's actually one of our sample beaches, and we've never seen it like that, thank goodness. So every 10 years, we do a kind of more comprehensive survey that goes from the west coast right up to Zululand. And we've done this 3 times, but the smaller survey area we've done 7 times now. And this is the kind of distribution of stuff that we get. You can see that most of it's clustered around the urban centres, so we are responsible for our own mess. But if we look at the trend data, this is what we see for bags and bottles. There's really no pattern there whatsoever. It's just a bunch of noise, really, going back to the 1980s. If we look at small things like lids and earbuds and straws, however, we see that there's been an exponential increase in the amount of junk. What's going on here? Well, it's because we've been increasing the amount of beach cleaning that's been going on, both formally and informally, which is great. It means that we have cleaner beaches, maybe, but they're not always cleaned very well, and this is our favourite beach, the Eastern Beach in East London, which is cleaned by the municipality every single day, and yet has these ridiculous amounts of rubbish. I mean, it's insane how much rubbish there is on that beach. So just because a beach is clean doesn't mean that it's clean, necessarily. It just tends to be the big things that get picked up. One of the problems, I'm going to go through this quite quickly, one of the problems with using beaches to monitor beach litter is it's a very dynamic environment, and you can't understand what's going on unless you consider all of the processes. So that litter arrives mostly floating from the sea, but it can also be wind-blown from the land, and it's also delivered by people who go to the beach for recreational purposes. And then it can be moved, so it gets blown up the beach, or it gets blown back into the sea, or it gets blown along the beach. And it also gets removed by beach cleaning. And that's the big problem we have in terms of monitoring. If you just go irregularly to the beach, is that the beach cleaning component has increased dramatically over time. But then you also get burial and exhumation. So remember, I was talking about the West Coast and how only 14% on the surface. That proportion changes depending on the beach profile. So with climate change and sea level rise, we're seeing increasingly big storm events and high storm surges which cut back the beach, and all of the plastic that's buried gets resuspended. And so just depending on where you are on that cycle, you're going to get a big change in the signal of what you see on the beach. And then we get UV-induced fragmentation that we were talking about earlier. So the big things gradually break down into small things, and we end up with this plastic confetti. So it's a very dynamic system, and it's really quite difficult to monitor what's going on. Having said that, these are the sort of broad overview maps of small plastic. So this is this plastic confetti, which is largely independent of beach cleaning, and there's no pattern of change in abundance over time. We've got the same spatial distribution, concentrations around the major urban centres, but the absolute amount of plastic on our beaches has not changed over the last 20 odd years. What about Inaccessible Island? There we don't have any beach cleaning because it's uninhabited. Back in the 1980s, still the only paper I've ever published in Nature was a little tiny note called Marine Litter Keeps Increasing, and this is the data it was based on. Went in 1984, then 87, 88, 89, and there was this exponential zooming up of plastic. Well, we cleared the beach in 89 to do an accumulation study. When we went back in 1999, I didn't do any litter work because I was busy with other things. 2009, that's what we found, and that's where we are now. But this kind of gross accumulation stuff is quite tricky because, again, it depends on how long-lived things are in the system. We know some big things live for a long time, maybe decades, but smaller things like bottles are probably degrading quite quickly. What we've seen very clearly is a massive increase in the number of bottles on the island, just insane increase. So this is just the plastic drink bottle numbers from the 1980s going forward, and that's increasing at about between 15 and 18% per year. If we go back to the 1980s, non-fishery litter, and the reason why I'm focusing on non-fishery litter is because it's relatively short-lived, so it's not stuff that's going to sit there forever. Most of it came from South America. The island sits in the middle of the South Atlantic, and stuff is blown by the westerly winds from South America until it hits the island. A little bit from Asia, Europe, Africa, and the rest. By 2009, South America was starting to become squished out by Asia. And this year, just unbelievable the amount of crap. 90% of the identified Asian items came from China. We didn't have a single Chinese item verified in 2009. So in the last decade, we've seen this massive change in the contribution of where the stuff is coming from. Most of it Chinese water bottles. This was a very famous paper that came out a few years ago in Science saying who's responsible for marine litter, and you can see China is number one. So we maybe shouldn't be too surprised. However, if you look at when the bottles were made, the date of manufacture of bottles arriving on the island while we were there, virtually all of them were only a year old at most. A couple of them a bit older. There's no ways those things have drifted from China in that time. So this is all dumping from vessels at sea. And this is despite the fact that China is a signatory to MARPOL Annex 5, which says you can't dump any persistent wastes, including plastics, at sea. It's been enforced since 1989. I think China signed in the 1990s. So it's not new to China, but they're clearly ignoring this. And this is one of the papers that we're going to try to get out quite quickly and try to put a bit of pressure on the Chinese to clean up their act. The other thing that we've been doing on Inaccessible to monitor the amount of plastic in the environment has been looking at plastic in seabirds. And one of the challenges to sampling plastic in seabirds is the petrels that tend to accumulate plastic, you can't sample them non-destructively. It's not easy to see how much plastic inside them. You can try to stomach pump them, which is pretty awful for you and them, but even then you don't get all of the plastic out. So really, to be sure you're getting all the plastic, you have to kill the bird, and that's obviously not something we want to do. But on Inaccessible, did I do something wrong? Anyway, on Inaccessible, we have somebody to kill the birds for us. I forgot to put in the slide. So there are these skuas that are predatory birds that eat the petrels, and then they puke up, like a gull, they puke up the indigestible bits. So each one of these is a pellet. This would have been a storm petrel, that was a storm petrel, and this was, I'm not sure, probably a great shearwater. And we can collect those and see how much plastic there is in them. And what we've seen since the 1980s, we've been doing this at roughly decadal intervals. We see in particular the proportion of industrial pellets has decreased across all species, so that's good news for the plastics industry. It means that their various initiatives to try to stop spilling nurdles are having an effect, or at least relative to the amount of other plastic in the environment that's available to birds. Pellets are much less important than they used to be. Up until the the last visit, we didn't see any really clear pattern in the amount of plastic. That's kind of continued. So this is the 3 resident species that we sample in large numbers, thanks to the skewers. And there is a significant difference from the 80s in broadbills, but it's kind of stabilized. The 2 storm petrels have pretty much stayed the same. And in fact, if you look closely, I mean, you can't read too much into these bars, but there's been a decrease in all of the resident species from 2009 to 2018. The glaring exception to that is the great shearwater, which has doubled its plastic load. It's the one bird that has the most plastic on the island. It's gone up from an average of 10 bits of plastic per bird to over 20 bits of plastic per bird. Why might this be? Well, great shearwaters are not resident in the South Atlantic. They spend our winter, the northern summer, wintering off Newfoundland and Greenland, and so this seems to indicate that there's potentially been a significant increase in the amount of floating plastic off that part of the world. I'm getting my luck here. I'm the opposite of Vonica. We'll just keep going. So another way that we can monitor what's happening with the environment using birds is looking at nest pollutants. It's not been done very often. There's a paper from 2007 showing that the proportion of kittiwake nests in a Danish colony containing plastic increased, but it's not a massive increase from 1992 to 2005. We've done a bit of work on this in South Africa, looking at kelp gulls, not so much at a trend level, but more at the spatial distribution. And we find that kelp gulls that breed close to dump sites tend to contain more plastic in their nest, and they use more plastic in nest construction if there's not much other material available. Not terribly surprising. But it would be interesting to see how this changes over time. The Department of what used to be Marine and Coastal Management from 1992 to 2000 did quite intensive surveys of plastic in seabird nests, and there's really no pattern in those data in terms of temporal trend, but there are big differences between species and between locations. Okay, so I'm going to quickly finish with the mystery, and that's the title of this talk, Where is All the Plastic? Lost at Sea. Now, when Richard Thompson wrote this paper in 2004, he was really punting the idea that all the plastic was sitting in microplastics. But buried in it is the mystery that still puzzles us, which is, okay, we can see from the 60s and the 70s the amount of plastic has increased. This is from continuous plankton recorded data, but it's not continuing to grow through the 1990s. This was something that Vonica showed you yesterday. We're producing more and more plastic. We're pumping it out into the environment. We're not really managing it any better. So why aren't we seeing an increase in the amount of plastic? This is arguably the best at-sea data available. It's Cara Lavender-Law's data out of, she operates out of Woods Hole, and they take these sort of sailing ship cruises around the Western Atlantic, and they've done 6,000 plus Newstone tows over 22 years, and they cannot see an increase in the amount of plastic. They can see that there's spatial pattern, most of the plastic is centered in the gyre and so on, but there's no significant change in the amount of plastic out there.
Was that microplastic?
It's this kind of stuff, so meso, micro, yeah. So why are we not seeing this? Well, this is what it really looks like when you go and do a net tow. You've got this little tiny tow in a bloody big ocean, and the distribution of plastic is not nice and randomly distributed, so you can use standard statistical models. It's very much clumped at convergence lines, especially in calm weather. The plastic gets pushed to where there's convergence. You'll see these drift lines. That's where the plastic is. It's also where a lot of the birds feed, because that's where food tends to accumulate. So the bottom line is you need lots of samples to detect change. So maybe there's just a statistical issue with not being able to detect a change, but still you'd think, given the amount of plastic we're churning out the whole time, we should be seeing more of a signal. Here's another study that came out last year, some quite long-term sampling in the Baltic Sea from the 1980s onwards. They sampled both the water column and fish, and they found plastic in both, but no signal whatsoever. So this is just the graphical abstract showing how production of plastic has increased, but there's no change in either the water plastic or the fish plastic, which is really kind of bizarre. This is going back to the Jambeck paper. they came up with an estimate 5 to 12 million tons of plastic are going into the sea every year. So even if we go with 5 million tons a year, that's an insane amount of plastic. Where's it going? Here's the best estimate of the amount of plastic floating around at sea, 250,000 tons. That's like a drop in the ocean of what we think we're putting in there every year. Where's it all going? So this is the mystery. So there's been a lot of work looking at what happens to floating plastic. There's been 3 or 4 kind of key papers that came out around about the same time. This is Eric van Sibyl's one. His model used satellite drift data to model what happens to plastic if you release it from coastal areas. We think most of the plastic going into the sea comes from populated coastal areas. So he just used coastal population as a proxy for plastic dumping into the sea. This is where it sits after 1 year, so you can see the Asian plume and a plume coming out of northeastern North America and a whole bunch in the Bay of Bengal and so on. And after 10 years, it's starting to accumulate in the gyres. We know that floating things accumulate in the middle of ocean basins because of the low currents that occur there. So you've got these whichever, anticyclonic, cyclonic, I can't remember. Anyway, you've got circulating water in each of the ocean basins, and plastic tends to accumulate in the center of those gyres. Interestingly, if you push it forward even further, you see the Indian Ocean really doesn't have a very stable gyre, and if you push it forward ridiculous lengths of time, all of the plastic ends up pretty much in the North Pacific with quite an intense bit in the South Pacific, but the South Atlantic migrates into the Indian and on into the Pacific. So this obviously is a model. It assumes that things will continue to float for very long periods, which is not necessarily true. Okay, we talked yesterday about different types of plastic and how they don't all float. So we're really talking about 3 polymers in the floating realm: high-density polyethylene, low-density polyethylene, and polypropylene. But they make up about 60% of the mass of plastic, so they are pretty important. The other ones will only float if they've got air trapped inside them. But what's really important is what kind of buoyancy each item has. So if there's no air trapped in something, typically it's got a density very similar to seawater, and it sits in the water column and it moves in the way that Eric's model suggests, which is that it moves with the current. However, if it's full of air, like expanded polystyrene or a bottle that's got its lid on still and is full of air, they sit well above the surface and they get blown along, and they move in quite different ways to the surface current. They can move much faster and do different things. But what also becomes clear is that they don't always stay at the surface, and over time they slowly start to sink. And this was driven home to me when we started recording bits of litter out in the ocean, and we found that as you move away from the coast, you just see fewer and fewer small bits of litter. Where are all the small things? When you're in Table Bay, there's lots of little bits of plastic, but as you move offshore, they get less common, and when you get really into oceanic waters, they're just not there at all. And this made us think, well, maybe it's to do with the surface area to volume. You know that small things have got relatively large surface areas. So again, this is a log scale reporting the surface area to volume. So anything that's high on this graph has got lots of surface area relative to its volume. And the shape influences this, particularly for big things. So if you're a sphere, you've got the smallest surface area to volume ratio possible. But as you become increasingly unspherical, so that changes. So something like a bag has a much higher surface area to volume ratio than a ball, just because it's long and thin. But once you get down to very small sizes, just the very fact that you're small means that you have a high surface area to volume ratio. Why is surface area to volume ratio important? That's what things settle on, the surface. And so I had a student do a really nice experiment where she made little bits of plastic of different sizes and thicknesses, put them out in the ocean, and see what happened to them. So these were all polyethylene. They all floated when she started, but she harvested them at different intervals over time, and you can see they were becoming encrusted with all sorts of biota. And the time it took for those things to sink was a function of how big they were. The more volume they had, the longer it took them to sink. But they all did sink in the end. And you might think, well, that's a rather childish experiment because it was done in a coastal water system and it's not what's happening out in the ocean. But in the ocean, you've got things like goose barnacles that settle on everything. And we were getting things washing up on Inaccessible that had 5 times their body weight, the weight of the item in goose barnacles. So they can become very heavily encrusted and dragged down. And this is not just an issue for very big things. It can be lots of biological mechanisms for exporting stuff. This was another really interesting paper that came out fairly recently showing how these giant larvaceans trap plastic. So all the little red and green speckles are in the mucus feeding house of this larvation. So the animal is this rather strange alien looking creature up here, but it spins this mucus house. And every so often, when that mucus house becomes clogged up, the larvation creates a little current through the house with its tail, and the mucus house traps the food. But every so often it sloughs off this house, and the house sinks to the bottom, carrying with it all that plastic. So there's a whole bunch of mechanisms, biologically mediated mechanisms, that are taking plastics out of the surface down to the seabed. In coastal waters, things can get weighed down by sand. So this looks rather strange, but it's actually a plastic bag that's been weighed down by sand and colonized by anemones and mussels and things in Intertidal at Muizenberg. When you dig it up, this is what you find. So the beach co-op cleanups every month. If you're interested, it's quite fun to come along. We spend a lot of time digging up plastic bags that have been colonized by things like this. Interestingly, things that go down can come up again. And this was a paper that I actually came across last night. It was really fun. Again by Irina Chubarenko, the Russian biologist working in the Baltic. And the pictures have gone weird again. I'll have to sort that out. But basically, she looked at the occasions when amber washes up. So Baltic Amber is apparently quite a sought-after product, and it has a similar density to the kinds of plastic that don't float in seawater, things like nylon and polystyrene and so on. And she was able to show that the amber tends to wash up when there's stormy weather and wave conditions, which lift the amber and dense plastic off the seabed. And she had those pictures are supposed to show a whole bunch of different plastic bottles and metal cans that were washing ashore after being on the seabed. And we've been seeing this with our Muizenberg cleanups as well. So occasionally we get this big eruption of dense plastic. So all of this polystyrene cutlery sinks in seawater, and you can see it's been colonized by bryozoa and various things. It's been on the seabed for some time, and then occasionally we get these massive events where it all washes up onto the shore. So the answer to our mystery, I'm rushing now because we're getting late, is we think that all the plastic, or at least a lot of it, is ending up on the seabed. Having said that, we've done a little bit of work on the seabed opportunistically around South Africa, and we're not seeing very much. Compared to what we see on our beaches, there's really not that much. We know there is big pools of it out there because it advects occasionally, but all of the random sampling that's been done is not finding much plastic, so it's a bit of a mystery still. And then, just cognizant of the comment yesterday about will you feel depressed by the end of this lecture series, I've tried to finish with a couple of good news stories. So I think that the most important good news story from all of our monitoring work is we're responsible for our own mess. And Eleanor will show you why this is. But the good news about that is we can do something about it. We don't have to wring our hands and blame the Chinese. Maybe if you live on Inaccessible, yes, but in South Africa, most of the rubbish comes from South Africa. So if we do something about it, we will see the benefits, and we can see whether what we're doing is working. So that's a good news story. And then another good news story is some of the persistent pollutants that we've banned, things like PCBs and DDTs, we can use plastics to actually track how they're changing over time from our long-term sampling, and we can see that those persistent pollutants are decreasing. So while plastics may be going up, some other pollutants which have been banned are going down. So that's my story for the day. I finished with this rather fun picture of a pelican flying off with a bag. It looks like it can't see, but it's a bit of a trick. But I think we're at a position now where we know enough to take off the blinkers and actually start to make a difference. So I hope that's been entertaining, and I'll finish with a happy picture of a flying squid for those of you who haven't seen a flying squid. Thank you very much. Now, I've cunningly managed to use up all the time, so if there's any urgent questions, otherwise we can talk more after Anya's talk on Whenever. Thursday. No questions. Bamboozled you all. Okay.